The night Rebecca Morrison started speaking in tongues, she had been clinically dead for 17 minutes. St. Catherine's Hospital, Boston, 3rd floor, intensive care unit, room 319. The machines hummed their monotonous symphony, tracking a life that wasn't supposed to exist anymore. Rebecca Morrison, 42 years old, mother of 2, had been in a vegetative state for 8 months following a catastrophic car accident on Route 95. The doctors had prepared her husband Daniel for the inevitable. Her brain activity was minimal. Her chances of recovery were statistically impossible. Yet here she was, breathing through a ventilator, her body a shell, waiting for permission to let go. Nurse Elena Rodriguez had seen hundreds of coma patients during her 15 years at St. Catherine's. She knew the sounds of the dying, the rattling breath, the irregular heartbeat, the moment when the body surrenders. But what she heard coming from room 319 at 2:47 in the morning was something entirely different, something that made her blood turn to ice in her veins. It started as a whisper, soft, almost melodic. Elena was doing her routine checks, adjusting Rebecca's IV drip, when she noticed the woman's lips moving. Subtle at first, then more pronounced. The ventilator tube prevented any real vocalization, but Elena could see the muscles in Rebecca's throat contracting, working, forming words that shouldn't exist. Elena leaned closer, her hand instinctively reaching for the call button. That's when she heard it. Not from Rebecca's mouth, but somehow from the air around her. Words in a language Elena didn't recognize. Guttural, ancient. The syllables tumbled over each other like rocks in a landslide, building momentum, growing louder. The temperature in the room dropped so suddenly that Elena could see her own breath materializing in white clouds. Rebecca's eyes snapped open, but they weren't her eyes anymore. The warm brown irises that Daniel had fallen in love with 20 years ago were gone, replaced by something that looked like black holes. Pupils dilated so completely that no color remained. Just darkness, deep, infinite, consuming. Elena screamed and stumbled backward, her back hitting the wall hard enough to knock the breath from her lungs. The call button. She needed to press the call button, but her hands wouldn't obey. They hung useless at her sides, paralyzed by a terror so primal it bypassed rational thought entirely. Rebecca's head turned slowly, mechanically, like a surveillance camera tracking movement. Those void black eyes locked onto Elena with an intelligence that was definitely aware, definitely conscious, and definitely not human. The words continued pouring from somewhere deep inside Rebecca's chest, vibrating through the room with enough force to rattle the medical equipment. The heart monitor flatlined, emitting its shrill alarm. But Rebecca's chest continued rising and falling, breathing, living, impossibly alive, despite what every machine insisted was death. Doctor. Marcus Chen burst through the door first, followed by 2 other nurses. He took one look at Rebecca and froze. His medical training evaporated in an instant, replaced by something older, something instinctive, fight or flight. His body chose flight, but his feet wouldn't move. The overhead lights began flickering. On, off, on, off, casting the room in strobing shadows that made Rebecca's jerking movements seem even more unnatural. Her fingers, which hadn't moved voluntarily in 8 months, curled into claws and dug into the thin hospital mattress. The fabric tore like paper. Then, as suddenly as it started, everything stopped. Rebecca's eyes rolled back. Her body went limp. The machines resumed their normal patterns. The temperature normalized, the lights stabilized. The only sound was the collective breathing of 4 medical professionals who had just witnessed something that would haunt their dreams for years to come. Dr. Chen approached the bed slowly, his hands shaking as he checked Rebecca's vitals. Pulse normal, blood pressure normal, brain activity elevated, significantly elevated. He looked at Elena, his face pale in the harsh fluorescent lighting. "Did you see that?" Elena whispered, her voice cracking. Before Dr. Chen could respond, Rebecca's hand shot out and grabbed his wrist. Her eyes opened again, but this time they were her own. Terrified, desperate, tears streaming down her cheeks. Her lips formed words around the ventilator tube, frantic and pleading. "It's coming." But here's what nobody knew yet, what they couldn't possibly understand in that moment of chaos and confusion. Rebecca Morrison hadn't been in a coma at all. She had been holding something back, something ancient, something hungry. And now, after 8 months of fighting, after 8 months of using every ounce of her consciousness to keep it contained within her broken body, she was losing. The hospital administration tried to keep it quiet. Dr. Chen filed his incident report at 4 in the morning, his handwriting barely legible. He described what happened in clinical terms. Patient exhibited spontaneous motor function, unexpected vocalization, temporary equipment malfunction. He left out the part about the eyes. He left out the part about the temperature drop. He left out the part about how every instinct in his body had screamed at him to run. Some things don't belong in medical records. Some things make you sound insane. St. Catherine's Hospital had a reputation to protect. Built in 1923, it had weathered scandals before, malpractice suits, funding investigations, but never anything like this. Never anything that couldn't be explained by human error or administrative oversight. Never anything that required security to confiscate cell phones and threaten staff with termination if they spoke to the media. Elena Rodriguez didn't come back to work for 3 days. When she finally returned, she requested a transfer to pediatrics. Management denied it. They needed experienced ICU nurses, especially on the night shift where staffing was already critically thin. So Elena stayed, but she refused to enter room 319. She would stand in the doorway during her rounds, checking monitors from a distance, her hand always resting on the cross she now wore around her neck. The other nurses noticed. Of course they noticed. In a hospital, gossip spreads faster than infection. Whispered conversations in the break room, sidelong glances exchanged during shift changes. Everyone knew something had happened in 319, but nobody knew exactly what, and nobody wanted to ask too directly. Because asking meant acknowledging, and acknowledging meant accepting that the world worked differently than they had been taught. Daniel Morrison sat beside his wife's bed every day from noon until 8 in the evening. He had been doing this for 8 months, 243 days of watching machines breathe for the woman he loved. 243 days of reading aloud from her favorite books, playing her favorite music, showing her photos of their children. The doctors said she couldn't hear him. The doctors said brain activity at her level didn't allow for consciousness or comprehension. But Daniel didn't care what the doctors said. He talked to her anyway. He held her hand, he kissed her forehead. He promised her they were waiting, that everyone was waiting for her to come home. He didn't know about the incident. The staff had been instructed not to tell him. Dr. Chen convinced himself it was for Daniel's own good. The man had suffered enough. Why give him false hope? Why tell him his wife had opened her eyes, had moved, had spoken, when she was back in her vegetative state within minutes? It would be cruel. It would be raising expectations that medicine couldn't fulfill. Better to let him have his quiet vigil. Better to let him hold on to whatever peace he had found in acceptance. But Rebecca knew Daniel was there, even when her eyes were closed, even when the machine said her brain was barely functioning. She could feel his presence like warmth against her skin. She could hear his voice cutting through the darkness that surrounded her, and she wanted to scream. She wanted to warn him. She wanted to tell him to take the children and run as far away as possible, because the thing inside her was getting stronger. It was learning, it was patient, and it was hungry for more than just her. Room 319 developed a reputation among the night staff. Equipment malfunctioned more frequently there than anywhere else in the ICU. IV pumps would alarm for no reason. Ventilator settings would change without anyone touching them. The call button would activate when no one was pressing it. The maintenance department grew tired of responding to false alarms. They checked the wiring twice. They replaced the nurse call system. They upgraded the monitoring equipment. Nothing helped. The room was cursed, some of the older nurses said. Built over the old morgue, others whispered. That's why patients in 319 never seemed to leave, at least not alive. Dr. Yolanda Foster didn't believe in curses. She had been the chief neurologist at St. Catherine's for 12 years. She believed in science, in data, in measurable outcomes. When Dr. Chen approached her about Rebecca Morrison, she dismissed his concerns immediately. Coma patients sometimes exhibited involuntary movements. Vocalization around breathing tubes was possible. The eyes opening was a reflex. Everything he described had a rational medical explanation. She ordered a new round of brain scans, MRI, EEG, PET scan to measure metabolic activity. If something was happening with Rebecca Morrison, the technology would reveal it. The scans showed something impossible. Rebecca's brain was lighting up like a Christmas tree. Areas that had been dark for 8 months were suddenly alive with activity, not just alive, hyperactive. Her frontal lobe showed patterns associated with complex thought and decision-making. Her temporal lobe was firing in ways consistent with language processing. Her amygdala was in overdrive. But here was the problem. Here was what made Dr. Foster stare at those scans for 3 hours straight, checking and rechecking the patient identification to make sure there hadn't been a mix-up. The patterns weren't consistent with a recovering brain. They weren't consistent with a healing brain. They were consistent with 2 separate consciousnesses, operating simultaneously in the same neural space. Dr. Foster didn't file a report. She didn't tell Dr. Chen. She didn't tell anyone. Instead, she locked the scans in her office and started researching. Medical journals, case studies, neurological anomalies. She found nothing that matched, nothing even close. So she expanded her search beyond medicine. Psychology, psychiatry, dissociative disorders, multiple personality syndrome. Still nothing. The patterns were too distinct, too separate, like 2 radio stations broadcasting on the same frequency, fighting for control of the signal. 3 nights after the incident, Rebecca spoke again. This time, she wasn't alone. Father Thomas Brennan received the call at 11:30 on a Thursday night. He was the hospital chaplain, a position he had held for 6 years after leaving parish ministry. His job was to provide comfort, last rites for the dying, prayer for the faithful, counseling for the desperate. He had never been asked to come to the ICU for a patient who was supposedly unconscious. He had never been asked to bring blessed water and his prayer book. He had never heard the kind of fear in Dr. Foster's voice that made it clear this wasn't a request. It was a plea. When he arrived at room 319, 5 people were already there. Dr. Foster, Dr. Chen, 2 nurses he didn't recognize, and Daniel Morrison, who looked like he had aged 10 years in the past week. They were all standing outside the room, staring through the glass window with expressions that Father Brennan had seen before. On the faces of soldiers, on the faces of accident survivors, on the faces of people who had witnessed something that fundamentally changed their understanding of reality. Rebecca was sitting up in bed. This should have been impossible. The ventilator tube was still in her throat. The restraints were still fastened around her wrists. But her spine was rigid, perfectly straight, as if pulled upward by invisible strings. Her head lolled to one side at an angle that looked painful. And her eyes. Those black, void eyes that Eleanor had described in her report. They were fixed on the window, fixed on the group of people watching her, fixed with an intelligence that was assessing, calculating, waiting. Father Brennan felt his mouth go dry. 40 years of ministry hadn't prepared him for this. Seminary taught theology. It taught scripture. It taught the theoretical existence of evil. But theory and reality are separated by a chasm that no amount of education can bridge. He touched the rosary in his pocket and whispered a prayer that felt inadequate the moment it left his lips. Daniel pushed past Dr. Foster and reached for the door handle. 3 sets of hands grabbed him simultaneously, pulling him back. He fought against them with the desperate strength of a man who had been helpless for too long. His wife was awake, After 8 months of darkness, after 8 months of waiting and praying and begging God for a miracle, she was finally awake, and they were keeping him from her. Dr. Foster grabbed Daniel's face, forcing him to look at her instead of the window. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking. She told him that Rebecca wasn't herself, that something was wrong neurologically, that they needed to run more tests before allowing visitors, that it wasn't safe. The lies tasted like ash in her mouth because she knew Daniel didn't believe a single word. He could see it in her eyes. The truth she was desperately trying to hide. This wasn't about neurology. This was about something medicine had no language for. Inside room 319, Rebecca's lips began moving again. The words came faster this time, more urgent. The temperature dropped so quickly that frost formed on the inside of the window. The machines went haywire, alarms shrieking, numbers flashing. The ventilator registered no breath, but her chest continued rising and falling with mechanical precision. Her fingers dug into the mattress hard enough to tear through to the foam underneath. The overhead lights exploded in sequence. Pop, 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 showering the room in sparks and broken glass. Then Rebecca's head snapped forward. Her eyes locked onto Daniel through the window, and for just a moment, for just one heartbreaking second, they were her eyes again. Brown, warm, filled with recognition and love and absolute terror. Her hand lifted, reaching toward him through the glass. Her mouth formed his name around the breathing tube, silent, desperate. Daniel screamed her name and lunged for the door. This time nobody could hold him back. He burst into the room and ran to her bedside, grabbing her outstretched hand with both of his. Her skin was ice cold. Her pulse raced beneath his fingers. He kept saying her name over and over like an incantation. Like if he said it enough times, she would stay. She would fight. She would come back to him completely. Rebecca's grip tightened on his hand. Painful, crushing. Her eyes flickered between brown and black, between herself and the thing sharing her consciousness. She was trying to speak, trying to force words past the tube and the darkness and the entity that was fighting for dominance. Father Brennan entered the room slowly, his prayer book open, his voice beginning the ancient rites of blessing and protection that the church had preserved for centuries. That's when Rebecca finally managed to speak. Not out loud, not with vocal cords and breath, but directly into Daniel's mind. A voice that was hers, but distorted, layered with harmonics that didn't belong in human speech. She told him what happened the night of the accident. The truth she had been carrying alone for 8 months. The truth that had opened the door for something else to enter. She had been driving to meet someone, not Daniel, someone from her past, someone she had loved before she met Daniel, someone who had contacted her after 15 years of silence and asked her to come, just to talk, just to explain why she had left all those years ago. She told herself it meant nothing, that she was happily married, that curiosity wasn't betrayal. But in her heart, in that secret place where we hide our real motives from ourselves, she knew she was lying. The accident happened because she was crying, because she was driving toward that meeting with shame burning in her chest and guilt tightening her throat, because she knew that crossing that line, even just to talk, even just to see him one more time, would change everything, would taint her marriage, would prove she was exactly the kind of person she had spent 20 years trying not to be. So she was crying, hard enough that she didn't see the truck until it was too late. The impact killed her, clinically, completely. Her heart stopped for 17 minutes on Route 95, while paramedics worked frantically to bring her back. And during those 17 minutes, Rebecca Morrison went somewhere else. Somewhere dark and vast and impossibly cold. A place where time didn't exist. Where her consciousness floated in an eternal void. Where she was completely and utterly alone. Except she wasn't alone. Something was there with her, watching, waiting, ancient beyond comprehension and hungry in ways that human language couldn't describe. It had been waiting in that space between life and death for centuries, millennia, feeding on the souls of those who died carrying guilt. shame, unconfessed sin, the weight of secrets that crushed the spirit. Rebecca Morrison arrived in that void heavy with all of it, and the entity recognized her immediately as prey. It offered her a choice: die carrying her shame and face whatever judgment waited beyond, or return to life, return to her husband and children, return to fix what she had broken and make peace with her guilt. But there was a price. There is always a price. She wouldn't return alone. The entity would come with her, sharing her body, sharing her consciousness, riding along in the passenger seat of her mind while she lived out her second chance. Rebecca said yes. Of course she said yes. Any mother would. Any wife who loved her family would trade anything for one more chance to hold them, to tell them she was sorry, to die having made things right instead of dying in the act of betrayal. So she agreed. She invited it in. She opened the door of her own free will. But the entity lied. They always lie. It had no intention of sharing. It had no intention of giving her control. The moment Rebecca's heart started beating again in that ambulance, the moment her brain received oxygen and her neurons began firing, the entity seized control completely. It locked her consciousness away in a prison of her own making. For 8 months she had been fully aware, fully conscious, trapped inside her own body while something else wore her like a costume, screaming silently while it learned how to use her muscles, her vocal cords, her memories. Daniel's hand gripped hers tighter as these truths flooded into his mind. His face went white, his legs buckled, because now he understood. The accident wasn't random, the coma wasn't medical, and the thing looking at him through his wife's eyes wasn't trying to take her. It already had her, had been using her body as an anchor to this world for 8 months, learning, growing stronger, preparing. Father Brennan's prayers grew more urgent, his voice rising above the alarms and the chaos. He sprinkled blessed water on Rebecca's forehead. The skin sizzled where the drops landed, releasing thin wisps of steam. Rebecca's body convulsed, her back arched impossibly far. The restraint snapped like thread. Her mouth opened wide enough that her jaw should have dislocated, and she laughed. Not her laugh. Not Rebecca's gentle, musical laugh that Daniel had fallen in love with. This was something ancient and cruel, a sound that belonged to predators and nightmares, a sound that made grown men want to curl into balls and weep for their mothers. It echoed through the ICU, triggering every alarm on the floor. Patients in other rooms began screaming. Nurses ran toward the sound and then away from it, their instincts overriding their training. But here's what nobody realized yet. What nobody could see, because they were focused on Rebecca. The entity hadn't been using her body as an anchor for 8 months. It had been using her body as bait, a lure, a trap. Because what draws more guilt, more shame, more desperate souls than a hospital? What place contains more people bargaining with God, making promises they can't keep, carrying the weight of choices they regret? St. Catherine's Hospital had become a feeding ground. And every person who had entered room 319 in the past 8 months, every doctor and nurse and visitor who had stood at Rebecca's bedside feeling helpless and sad and guilty for their relief that it wasn't them in that bed, had left a piece of themselves behind. A thread, a connection, a doorway. The entity wasn't possessing Rebecca Morrison. It was possessing everyone who had touched her, everyone who had grieved near her, everyone who had let their guilt and fear fill that room like poison gas. And now, after 8 months of preparation, after 8 months of gathering strength from the ambient despair of an entire hospital, it was ready to emerge fully, to cross over completely, to make this world its hunting ground. Rebecca's final telepathic message to Daniel wasn't a confession. It was a warning. It wasn't her guilt that opened the door. It was everyone's. The collective shame of an entire building full of people confronting mortality and finding themselves wanting. And she had been the catalyst, the focal point, the sacrifice offered unwillingly on an altar built from good intentions and medical science, and the arrogant assumption that darkness couldn't exist in a place dedicated to healing. Dr. Foster understood first. While everyone else stared in horror at Rebecca's convulsing body, while Father Brennan prayed, and Daniel wept and the nurses fled, she understood the mechanism. The entity fed on guilt and shame and fear. It had been collecting those emotions like a battery storing charge, but emotions are energy, and energy can be redirected, transformed, used against its collector. She grabbed Father Brennan's arm and shouted over the chaos, "Stop praying for protection, stop asking for the entity to leave." Instead, she told him to do something that went against every instinct, every theological principle he had ever learned. Pray for forgiveness. Not Rebecca's forgiveness. Everyone's forgiveness. Every person in this building carrying guilt. Every doctor who made a mistake. Every nurse who couldn't save a patient. Every family member who arrived too late. Every soul who walked these halls, haunted by the weight of their own humanity. Forgive them all. Release them. Cut the threads the entity had been weaving for 8 months. Father Brennan hesitated for only a second, then his voice changed. The words of exorcism fell away, replaced by something simpler, more profound. A prayer of absolution that wasn't asking for divine intervention but declaring it. Proclaiming that every person touched by suffering in this place was released from their burden. That guilt was a human condition, not a supernatural sentence. That shame could not define a soul that chose to let it go. The effect was immediate and devastating. Throughout St. Catherine's Hospital, people felt something lift. Patients who had been restless became calm. Nurses who had been crying dried their tears. Doctors who had been carrying the weight of impossible decisions felt their shoulders relax. The collective emotional atmosphere shifted so dramatically that it was almost physical. And in room 319, the entity screamed. Because it was starving. Its food source was evaporating. The threads it had woven were dissolving. Rebecca's body jerked violently as the entity tried to maintain its hold, but its grip was weakening with every person who accepted forgiveness, with every soul who chose to release their shame. Daniel held his wife's hand tighter, adding his own declaration. He forgave her, for the accident, for the secret meeting, for the guilt that had opened this door. He forgave her completely and without condition. Rebecca's eyes flickered one final time between black and brown, between the entity and herself. And in that moment of transition, she made a choice. The entity had lied about many things, but it had been truthful about one. She had invited it in of her own free will, which meant she could revoke that invitation, but doing so would close the door it had used to enter this world. And she was on the same side of that door. Sending it back meant going with it. She looked at Daniel, really looked at him with her own eyes for the first time in 8 months. She mouthed 3 words. Take care of them. Then she closed her eyes, took a breath that wasn't supplied by the ventilator, and let go. Not of life, but of her claim to it. She embraced the entity inside her consciousness and dragged it backward through the door it had opened, back into the void between life and death, back into the darkness where it belonged. And she sealed the door behind them both. Rebecca Morrison's body died at 3:17 in the morning. This time, there was no dramatic collapse, no alarms, no chaos. Her heart simply stopped beating. Her brain activity ceased. The machines confirmed what everyone in the room already knew. She was gone, truly gone, and she had taken something ancient and hungry with her. A sacrifice made not from guilt, but from love. Not from shame, but from redemption. The hospital felt different after that night, lighter somehow, as if a pressure that nobody had consciously noticed had been lifted. Staff stopped requesting transfers from the 3rd floor. Equipment malfunctions decreased. Patients in the ICU began recovering at statistically improbable rates. Room 319 was eventually renovated and reopened. No more incidents occurred there. No more unexplained phenomena. Just the normal rhythms of healing and loss that define every hospital. Daniel Morrison buried his wife 3 days later. The funeral was small, intimate. He told their children that their mother had fought very hard to come back to them, and that her fight had meant something important. He didn't tell them the whole truth. Some truths are too heavy for children to carry. But he told them enough, that their mother had been brave, that she had loved them more than anything, that her final act was one of protection and sacrifice. Father Brennan left hospital chaplaincy 6 months later, not because of trauma, not because his faith was shaken, but because it had been fundamentally transformed. He had witnessed evil, true evil, but he had also witnessed something more powerful, the human capacity to choose love over fear, to choose sacrifice over survival, to transform guilt into grace through the simple act of forgiveness. He went back to parish ministry with a new understanding. That darkness is real, but so is light. And light always has the final word. Years later, Dr. Foster would occasionally find herself standing outside what used to be room 319, wondering if it had really happened, wondering if collective trauma could actually manifest as something supernatural, or if they had all experienced a shared delusion brought on by stress and exhaustion. She never reached a conclusion, but she changed how she practiced medicine. Started asking patients about their emotional burdens as carefully as she asked about their physical symptoms. Started understanding that healing wasn't just about treating bodies, but about releasing souls from the prisons they build for themselves. The question that haunted everyone who witnessed those events wasn't about what the entity was or where it came from. It was simpler and more troubling. If collective guilt could create a doorway for darkness, what else might human emotion be capable of manifesting? What other forces might be feeding on the ambient suffering of places where pain congregates? And most disturbing of all, how many other doors are standing open right now, unnoticed? In hospitals and prisons and anywhere else where people gather to confront their mortality and find themselves lacking. Think about that the next time you walk through a hospital corridor at night. The next time you feel that inexplicable chill. The next time you sense something watching from the shadows of a room where someone is dying. Because maybe, just maybe, our emotions are more powerful than we understand. Maybe guilt and shame and fear aren't just feelings. Maybe they're invitations. And maybe the only thing standing between us and the darkness that waits beyond is our willingness to forgive ourselves and each other, to release the weight we carry, to transform fear into the very thing that saves us. Have you ever felt something watching you in a hospital? Have you ever carried guilt so heavy it felt like a physical presence? Share your story in the comments. Because sometimes, speaking our fears out loud is the first step toward defeating them. Sometimes confession is the cure. In the end, perhaps the real miracle was fear.